or if you are new to the COP or just coming in, something that you hope to be gaining from it looking into 2018. Okay, so that's the challenge. And with that, I will go ahead and get started. So not to put other people on the spot. So as said earlier, my name is Hillary Proctor, and I'm from Making Sense International. And one of the things that I'm looking forward to in 2018 is having a chance to really get to know the network and the other professionals that are inside of it and the experiences and researches that you will bring. Here we go.
Good morning, my name is Olga Merchant. I am the Youth and Workforce Advisor at the Office of Education at USAID. And one of the things that I have learned this year is I'm actually paying a lot of attention to the lack of soft skills that some of my colleagues have.
Serious honesty. My name is Sharon Bezin. I'm with IYF, and what I have gained from my limited exposure to the COP is a better understanding of the actors in this space, as I'm brand new to this field.
All right, my name is David Bowens. I'm on the CIES Youth Development and Education Special Interest Group. I'm a researcher with the University of Johannesburg and also with the Global Partnership for Education right now. And this network gives me strength because I'll read the emails and I'll be like, okay, I need to keep writing up my research.
I'm Cassandra Jesse, the Director for YouthPower Learning, representing Making Sense International and the International Center for Research and Women, so beautiful bridge for today. And for me, actually, this brief, I think, is fabulous. I'm excited we're going to be talking about it today because really thinking about measuring soft skills is so important, and this is a great contribution.
I'm Wendy Wolf. I'm the Youth Power Learning Project Manager employed with Making Sense International, and I'm just looking forward to seeing what comes out of the COP, what events we put on this year, and
I'm Midena, an Atlas Fellow at Making Sense International. I'm working with YouthPower as well. COP has been a new learning experience for me as well, so I'm looking forward to see how I can use it in the future when I go back to Albania.
Hi, Holly Christopherson. I work at Plan International USA, and I have been really interested in all of the research that's been coming out on soft skills. It's been very helpful, and I've been using that to improve our programs.
Hi, I'm Emma Baki. I'm with Justice Consulting Group, and I'm actually helping to do an assessment of USAID's youth policy. So this is an exciting opportunity for me to get a better sense of youth power.
Hi, I'm Debbie Andina. I'm new in the community of activists. I joined only 2 months and I've learned a lot. I specialize in designing and developing youth development programs, and we implement our projects in Egypt. So this is where I'm from originally. I've learned a lot from this community because I always follow up on all the latest research and techniques, and I look forward in 2018 to connect with more people in the community and learn more.
So my name is Jackie Briggs. I'm at DAI, and I'm new to this community of practice. I've been to several of the others. I'm looking forward to kind of being the bridge between those communities of practice and my employer.
Jackie, do you want to get at the back?
Sure, thanks. My name is Paul Spurs. I'm with Physio and ARIA Network, and I'm new to the group. I'm very excited to learn about all the research in youth development as we scale teacher training and youth development programs in Latin America.
Hi, I'm Shelby French. I'm the Senior Technical Advisor for Adolescent and Youth Development and Protection at Child Fund International, and I'm new to the COP. I believe my colleague Anita Anastasio may have participated, so since I'm here, she's in Zambia, and it's definitely a part of my work. I'm very much looking forward to learning more. Turned off really quickly.
Hi, my name is Lina Zanchia. I'm the Director of the Africa Works Our programming is youth-based, work readiness, as well as leadership and also social enterprise in the Africa region. I'm new to COP, so I'm looking to learn more about youth competencies and how they can assist in the emerging youth bulge around unemployment.
I'm Leah Hoffman. I'm from Lutheran World Relief. I'm the Regional Program Manager for Africa. And I'm new to the COP, so I'm looking forward to networking and cutting edge youth practices.
I'm Katie Honeyman. I lead the workforce development practice at World Learning. And I appreciate the materials produced by the COP because typically I have to do a literature review when I start a new job. In this case, I didn't have to. I just read all the literature.
I'm Kate Foley. I just joined Comonics in their education and youth practice. This is my first time at a COP. I'm excited to network and learn from this practice to see how we can better inform our projects at Comonics.
I'm Rebecca Pagel. I work on the M&E team at the Education Development Center. And for me, the COP really has been a community of people that I can talk to about soft skills. And don't ask me to stop talking.
Do I have to wait? Okay. Hi everyone, Laura Henneman from International Youth Foundation. One thing that I found extremely valuable from the COP was the cross-sectoral analysis of skills and some of the discussions that were held around the release of that paper. So I may be cheating because that might have been late 2016, but it was really valuable and useful for our work. Thank you, Maria. May I toss it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go. I'm Maria Brandon. I'm the Senior Knowledge Management Specialist with YouthPower Learning. And what I've learned, I think, from this community is how valuable it is to have this diversity of a group of more senior specialists as well as younger and perhaps newer to the practice members, because I think that's what strengthens but also strengthens the knowledge that is being spread out.
I want to take my turn too. So I'm Daniel Plow. Come on.
Don't say it.
So I'm Daniel Plow. I'm a program officer at RFD, and I've been leading the COP for the past couple of years. And I think the biggest thing that I get out of it is that a lot of times we're all sort of facing similar problems in our own work, but we don't have others to talk to about it. And so having everybody come in together, we might not get to the answer, but we definitely at least have this sort of venting capacity for knowing that other people are struggling with the same thing and start working towards some of the solutions. Thank you everybody for your introductions. We didn't miss anybody, did we? No. So I want to go ahead and move on just to start by going over the agenda. So this is where we are now, refreshments and introduction. Want to give you guys just a warm welcome and make sure that you're able to grab some breakfast. We're going to start after this with I'm going to quickly go through our accomplishments for 2017 and define the meeting's objectives for what we want to do for the rest of the day. We then are going to move into a technical brief panel, which is to discuss a technical brief that Maria passed out, which we launched a couple months ago. And we'll have myself as well as a couple of the case study contributors to discuss that, and Maria is going to help us to facilitate that discussion. We're then going to look forward to 2018 and have a little bit of a brainstorm with everybody in the room about what are the things that really are most important to you with the COP going forward, and which topics have you been struggling with or thinking about that we could tackle together so that we can start planning ahead for the activities that we will be taking part in for 2018. And then finally, we'll just have some closing thoughts, next steps, and we want to save the last 30 minutes or so to have everybody connect and network. That's a big value of the COP, we think, and so we want to make sure that you guys are able to have a little bit of time to do that. Cool. I'll start. One more thing to mention. You guys may know that YouthPower and a number of other organizations are hosting today a Twitter chat on gender-based violence in education and how to resolve it with education. That's happening right now. We actually are going to have the Twitter feed up on the side of the screen here, but we encourage you to contribute to that conversation because it's a really important one. So let's start by just listing our accomplishments to date. It's exciting to hear that we have so many new faces in the room, and so giving you a little bit of a background of what we've done so far is an important one. So first, to start with our COP goals. So these, when we started the COP, we started by coming up with the COP charter, which really lays out our objectives and goals. And these are our two main goals. One, to facilitate our members' exchange of knowledge, experiences, and ideas to build better understanding within the COP of cross-sectoral skills, their role, potential for impact on positive youth development programs. So really, we want to bring folks together and actually facilitate what we all already know individually and make that sort of our common knowledge about cross-sectoral skills for youth. And then two, we want to contribute to our field by co-creating new knowledge and collaborating on research to tackle key challenges in this field. And so the technical brief is a good example of that, something that we sort of surveyed the COP membership and really understood that people were struggling with this topic of how do you adapt these assessments across different contexts. And so coming up with a way to synthesize that information so that everybody can have that knowledge is the kind of work that we like to do, but also we feel pushes the field forward. So that's our second main goal. What have we done? So this is actually an old slide. I wanted to have it here just as a point of reference. Every time we have one of these meetings, I like to update this slide. And as you can see in this next one, it really got sort of untenable. We can't really do it anymore. We're going to have to retire it because it's not really practical. But it gives you an idea of everything that we've done. And we've actually grown significantly in membership. From last year, this time we had 240 members. We now have 472 in our listserv, which is really impressive. And it shows that there's really a demand for something like this. I'll go through a few of our accomplishments this year more specifically. So we've had a few in-person meetings. This time last year, we had a meeting that we collaborated on with YouthPower Action, and we actually collaborated on with them as they launched a few reports on soft skills development. If you guys are not aware of those reports, we can link you to them. They're super interesting and have a lot of value to our community. We also had another in-person event in February when we featured research that was done by EDC through a grant that YouthPower Learning provided. We have a grant under contract mechanism where folks can bid for particular research, and EDC has been doing some really interesting work on soft skills in a few different countries, and we sort of use an opportunity to bring folks together to discuss some of their early findings and help them with some guidance about what it is that they could do going forward, which we hope was helpful. Yeah. Cool. We also have our webinars. We usually try to host a few of these a year. Most recently, we've had a gender and skills development webinar that we hosted with our gender and PYD COP members, which was really well attended and I think generated a really good conversation about economic opportunity and skills development for young women. We also have recently had a youth employability webinar that really focuses on financing youth employability programs, which is sort of it's a little bit of inside baseball. It's a little bit more thinking about how do you actually structure these programs in a way that are sustainable. But I think actually generated a really cool conversation, and we provided some interesting sort of innovative examples of how to do that. Both of those webinars were recorded and are actually on our YouthPower Learning page. So if you missed out on those, you can go back and watch them. And we have the presentations from those as well. We also recently, not recently, but in March, had a panel at the Comparative International Education Society conference. I think I got that right. In Atlanta, and Maria was part of that. My colleague Caitlin was part of that as well. And we really focused on that one in talking about skills for youth in challenging environments, so including environments where conflict is happening, more unstable environments in regards to migration, and focused on discussing some programs that are working in that area and what some of the lessons are that we can take for that, which I think was a super successful engagement. We then have our technical brief, which we just launched a few months ago, and we'll go into this a lot more in detail, but really, at least once a year, we try to come up with some sort of joint research product. They usually take the form of these technical briefs. We did one last year on sort of recruitment and retention approaches to getting youth to stay in skills programs, to join and stay within those. That's also available on our website. This year focused on the sort of adaptability of cross-sectoral assessments or cross-sectoral skills assessments. And so we'll talk a little bit about that during our panel. I think a couple other things I didn't mention, or at least I didn't create slides for that are worth mentioning. that we did. We do have obviously our listserv and our Google group that we manage, and folks are really welcome. For those that are new, you should feel welcome to contribute to that, both by telling us a little bit about you and what you're doing and what work you're doing. Also telling if there's a particular problem that you're facing, if there's something that you want to ask a room of 472 people who have similar jargon in mind, you can use that to ask questions. You can use that to leverage resources. If you want to share a report that you publish, if you want to share research that you found that you think might be useful, we really think that's a really valuable part of the community, and increasingly so as the membership goes up. We feel like there's a lot of content there that's super useful for folks. Another thing that we've recently done is create a What Works page on the YouthPower Learning website, and that actually has something that we did to identify some sort of crucial resources that are part of this field and summarize them and include them on the website so that folks who are sort of new to this concept of cross-sectoral skills can go on there and take a look and see the sort of key resources that they need to know if they want to know more about this. And so that's another important resource that we've created. I think I've covered everything that we did recently, but any questions from anybody about what I covered so far? No? Okay, cool. So that's looking back. Now we're looking forward, and that's a big part of what we're doing here today, is actually looking forward into 2018, and we want to consult you on what we'd like to do going forward. So a few things on that. Number one is that we wanted to use this meeting also to announce a particular transition as far as the COP leadership. Like I said, we at R4D, including my colleagues Caitlin and I, and Shuba as well, who a lot of you met, we've been leading the COP for the past couple of years. And we're actually excited now to announce a leadership transition in that, so that Hillary will be serving as a co-champion, and then we'll also get some more folks from her team to support as well. We'll be transitioning off completely by February, and the reason for that is just that we've been doing it for a few years, and now F4D needs us to focus a little bit more on a few other work things within the education team, including a new strategy that we have. And so we're still going to be strong contributing members to the COP. It's a super important resource for us too, but the leadership, the reins, we're going to hand over to Hillary. So that's one transition, and we're excited that she's able to join us here in person today to sort of help us do that transition in the meeting. So that's exciting.
And if anybody's interested in after February taking that role, let me know.
Yeah, there's an opportunity for some more leadership roles as well if folks are interested. The other thing as far as looking forward is that we have a continued commitment to learning activities. So we have these webinars, the in-person meetings, the research that we do. And so we want to discuss that going forward and figuring out, as we move through the next year and this leadership transition, what are the things that we want to focus on and which products are most valuable to folks. And so that's something that we really want to get your input on. We also want to get input from folks online, and we want to also, there's a group of 472 people who can pitch into this conversation, so we'll find ways of also getting their input if they couldn't be here in person or online today. And then finally, we want to just touch on something that's really exciting that the YouthPower Learning team is doing, which is a learning agenda that is really being developed around a lot of the gaps that we've identified with the YouthPower Learning research so far in regards to what is known and what isn't known about positive youth development and generally youth development programs. And so today's an opportunity to sort of tell you a little bit more about that, and Maria is going to do that, and Cassandra also in one of our last sessions. But just to also make sure that you know that in addition to the COP activities, this is also something that you can provide input to, and it has some bigger implications for the research that YouthPower does. So that's it. That's our intro. Any questions? No? All right. Cool. So if there are no other comments or questions, we maybe just want to move on to our panel. And I will bring up the presentation here, and Maria can get us started.
All right. So, I think this is one of our best briefs that we have. And I was really super excited about this. I think it tackles one of the most important topics, which is adapting assessments to different environments in different countries. And especially anybody who has ever done a systematic review or anything, you will know how difficult it is to compare things, research across the board, and somebody might be measuring one thing and somebody else is measuring the same thing, but once you dig deeper, you find out that actually they were measuring something completely different. And so I think this topic is just really key. So I'm very excited to have our presenters here. And so I think you were all going to do some short introduction. So I don't know who wants to start. And I think so we have I don't know if you want to, but just a few words about Rebecca and about Lara. So Rebecca actually led one of the research activities that YouthPower Learning funded with a grant. And so I think you applied actually one of these approaches. And then Lara is a manager for corporate programs and master trainer and coach for IYF's Passport to Success Life Skills curriculum. And so she obviously has a lot of background in that whole area. So we're excited to have you.
Awesome. Thank you, yeah. And so I'm going to get started as a sort of weird member of this panel by just introducing a bit about the technical brief and what we did, and then we'll let these guys really talk about the work that they do that is relevant to this project. So you have to hear me talking a little bit more. But just to give you a little bit of a background, so on what this technical brief is, which we co-authored really as a COP, but a lot of my colleagues at RFD also put a lot of time into. I'll go over the purpose of the technical brief, the methodology that we used, and then some of the findings that we have from the lit review, the case studies that we did, and finally just some lessons learned about this process. And so, starting with the purpose, really what we wanted to do, and this is going to sound familiar coming from the objectives that I laid out of our COP, really we wanted to gather and synthesize lessons learned from our implementers that are part of our COP in this particular topic. And so we know that adapting soft skills measurement tools is a difficult thing to do. We know that comparing those results is difficult, and we wanted to get a sense from the folks that are in our bigger community room, what they know, what they've learned, and so that we can all sort of learn together about that. A couple of reasons why we chose this topic. We did consult the COP membership, and this is something that folks express interest in. Generally, measuring soft skills is a task that is continuously challenging to folks, program implementers, and M&E experts. Obviously, we know there's a lot of evidence about how important these skills are, including across different sectors, but they're sort of intangible and hard to capture, and so measuring them really makes is really a challenge. And then finally, when you add to that the sort of geographic and cultural context that everybody in the room sort of works in, the diversity in that, makes it really difficult to make sure that you have one assessment that is fitting to all of those different environments. So that's really the purpose of why we decided to do this, and we figured it was a really important question to dive into. A little bit about our methodology and how we went about doing this. After we selected the topic, and again we consulted with our COP membership about this, we started reviewing some literature, and we asked our COP members, what are the really important resources that you know about that we can consult in order to get a good sense of what the challenges are in measuring across contexts, what people have done so far. And so we did a brief, non-comprehensive review of the literature. This was very purposive, and so we just found some things that were super informative from a lot of our membership as well. We then asked for participation from case study participants. So we inquired folks from the COP to really provide examples of when they've done this type of work and how it's worked out for them. And we had a few different folks from the COP provide notes on what they've done in the past and how helpful it's been. And based on that, we started reaching out to folks to be part of our case studies. And so we reached out to Rebecca, we reached out to Lara, and we also reached out to some folks at World Vision who couldn't join us today, but were also featured as a part of the case studies. And along with my colleague Radhika, we did interviews with them to really kind of dig deep into what they do, what challenges they face in doing it, and what we can learn from that. Once we did that, we conducted our analysis and sort of laid out our findings, and we provided a first draft for the COP to review. We send that to all of our members so they could take a look as a Google Doc. We really sort of see this as a product of the whole community, and so we want to make sure that people are able to contribute that way. And once we got feedback from them, we revised that and have it now as a final draft. So that's a little bit about the process. A little bit about what we found in our lit review. This is definitely preaching to the choir, so you guys probably know a lot more about soft skills than even I do. But just to get a sense, this is what we landed on as far as a quick definition on this. For the purposes of this particular brief, we know that this is a term that even has multiple names to it, but we wanted to stick with this just because the literature sort of mainly talked about it in terms of soft skills, and we want to just be faithful to that literature for this purpose. Obviously, these are skills that can be relevant in a wide variety of ways. There are also skills that are applicable in a wide variety of sectors and outcomes, and so it's important that we really figure out the best ways to assess them. A couple other things that we learned from the lit review part, as far as the challenges go, we found that the literature pointed to 3 main challenges in adapting these soft skills measurements across different sectors. The first is a self-reporting bias, and this is a bigger problem with these kinds of assessment in the first place. A lot of them, and some recent reviews done by YouthPower Action, still find this, that a lot of these tools rely on self-reported methods to identify actually what skill sets are. And that's a problematic way to do it. It's one of the more, I'm not going to say convenient ways, but it's the way it's been done in the past because it's a difficult thing to measure. But there are some challenges there, and especially considering that a lot of times, as we found, youth often do not report accurately about their skill sets. One of the big issues that we find specific to adaptation across context is that there's a lack of common terminology and understanding around these concepts. And a lot of these assessments have been developed with a sort of Western cultural frame in mind. And so as a result, you get terms like critical thinking, which may be something that we're all on the same page about, but once you transfer it to different contexts, different cultural environments, might not mean the same thing to different people. And so really getting a sense of what the meaning is and how to actually refer to these skills in different contexts is really important, and make sure that we're not sort of imposing our own terminology and values is important as well. And then finally, we saw that there's some differences in the value of soft skills across cultures. Depending on where you are, the sort of weight of a particular skill set might be different. And so as a result, you might, it might be sort of self-serving for you to say that you're good at one thing versus another. And that doesn't really align well with if we want to have data that we can compare across countries, if we want to have data that is really representative of folks' skill sets, it gets challenging to do. And so really figuring out exactly what is valued in different in countries and different contexts and actually adjusting your assessment to that is something that we found was a challenge to many folks. I'm going to quickly just say, not what they did because that's what they're going to do, but just quickly just tell you about our case study participants. We had EDC who really focused on, in their case study, we sort of created these little titles, but really grounding assessment data through anchoring vignettes. And they created this assessment along with some partners of theirs called the Anchor BFI, which is adaptable across contexts and really tries to limit the fakeability of scores and the self-rating of scores. And Rebecca is going to tell us a little bit more about that. And they've implemented this in a few different countries, including Rwanda, Honduras, and Philippines, and hope to use it going forward even further. We have World Vision, who, like I said, couldn't join us today, but have a really interesting way of doing this. They started by thinking through something called the developmental assets profile, which is a tool that they really liked, and how to adapt that to different contexts. And they actually developed a whole contextualization process in order to adapt this assessment to different situations, which they now also use for soft skills assessment. And their process is a really interesting one, which includes some on-the-ground research about these skills concepts in each place they go. It includes some translation exercises with youth, so that they have an input into how these terms are being framed, as well as some staff expert translation and screening and piloting that happens on the ground. And so they've done this in 15 different countries, and more recently, again, moving that same sort of process to their soft skills work. And then finally, we have the International Youth Foundation, which Laura is going to be talking about, and their development of an assessment that is going to be digital, that actually is adaptable across a number of different countries. And they actually have some really interesting data on this from their pilot that they've been doing in 6 different countries, and really trying to figure out how do you create an assessment that's flexible enough to be used in all these different contexts. And so she's going to tell us a little bit more about that. I'll just wrap up with some of the lessons learned. And again, you all have a copy of the technical brief, so there's a lot more detail there. And if you have any questions, please let us know. But a few things that we found in common with our case studies and in the literature that are really important in this process of adapting tools. Number one, we saw that having a diverse collaborative team is really crucial in adaptation. Everyone that we talked to mentioned the sort of importance of having both a mix of technical experts that know assessments and know them well, but also having staff members who are on the ground in the context where you're creating the assessment, that really know the youth they're engaging with, that really know the cultural context. And so having that diversity is really important and crucial to make sure that both sides of that coin sort of work. We also found that involving youth early on was a common practice among our case studies, and actually something that they felt was really important. So making sure that youth themselves have a say in this assessment or can contribute to the creation of it is not only something that ensures its local relevance, but also is something of an empowering thing, because youth actually feel like they are not just being assessed on something, they feel like they're contributing to an effort to understand these skills, and it's something that's super valuable. Third, we found that, this is a weird one, and I had a hard time even phrasing this when I was writing the brief, but we found that the process of actually completing an assessment is not something that folks immediately think of when you think about the assessment design usually, but that it can have just as many contextual factors as the content of the assessment itself. So what I mean by that is this: we can think a lot about the terms that are in an assessment and the kinds of questions that are there and how they fit a particular context. But we found that a lot of our case study participants said that actually the format of how you take the assessment, the timing that it takes, the way that the assessment is delivered actually is a super important thing to consider, and to consider culturally to make sure that you have thought through what's best for that particular context, because that plays a huge role into the data that you get as well. And so thinking through that process is crucial. And then finally, adaptation is sometimes needed within countries, and this is, an added nuance that I think we should all have in our minds anyway, but just because you make an assessment for the Philippines doesn't mean that everyone in the Philippines is going to be able to take that assessment the same way. You might have to think about considerations relative to class, to geography, to gender, and adapt in those ways as well, because you want to make sure that you get data that's most representative of the population you're working with. So that's important to consider. And then finally, and this is a big overarching one, thinking about the purpose of your assessment is crucial to figure out how do you adapt it. Not everyone has to adapt in the same way, because the purpose of different assessments are different. And so, while EDC might be doing one thing because it fits their needs, that doesn't mean that everyone else should do this exact same thing. And making sure that you know your limitations and you stick to those, and not necessarily jump to what is going to be absolutely the most rigorous way of doing this. If that's not really fitting to your purpose, then maybe don't. And so that's the idea. And that's it. And there's a lot more references. There's a lot more in the brief, and we are happy to see questions. But just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of what we found, and then allow my colleagues to talk a little bit more about the really interesting work that they're doing.
Thank you. I think that is a great introduction in terms of what the purposes are and what some of the challenges are. So we're excited to now hear a little bit more from Rebecca and Lara about how you actually did it and some of the challenges that perhaps you may have encountered. So shall we start?
We could do the order in the brief.
Oh, it's okay.
Can you confirm for us where the camera is for the online?
Yes, the camera is there.
Okay.
So everyone can see. We're seated here because they can see us. We're not turning back to them. But yes.
All right, thanks, Laura. At EDC a few years ago, we started to think through a problem that we had in assessing our youth soft skills, and that was that problem was kind of highlighted by the insight that the ideal expression of a soft skill might look different in different contexts. So if you think about what does hardworking look like to you, that's probably constructed by the range of hardworking and lazy on the other end of the spectrum people that you've met in your life and the cultural values that you were raised with. So that insight was a big challenge for our assessment work. So, and why is this such a challenge? Well, a couple of things. The first is construct validity. You want to make sure that you're measuring what you think you're measuring or what you're saying you're measuring. And if hard work looks different in culture A than in culture B, you're probably measuring two different things in those two cultures when you deliver the same test questions to people in those two cultures. So that was a big concern. Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? The other was that EDC's programs, like many of our programs, are implemented in several different contexts. So if we want to evaluate those programs, and we want to do it in a standardized way so that we can get data that tells us something about how that program is working, we need a tool that we can deliver consistently across these different cultures. And the last reason this was important is maybe a little bit more indirect, but I think it's extremely important for us to all think through, is that we all know that sometimes, especially if we're working with ministries of education or trade or whatever, or governments, that these entities are often taking our data and maybe are restating it in ways that we can't control once that report is out of our hands. So we were very aware that if we were going to deliver a program in Thailand and in Rwanda, or let's say a better example, Rwanda and the DRC, using an assessment that allowed anyone to think we were comparing the two different cultures' soft skills, that a government could use that to say, oh look, our culture, our youth are better at hard work, are more hardworking than youth in your culture. And I use the example of Rwanda and DRC because of the ethnic implications of that comparison. So you can see how that could have some dangerous, I know I'm being extreme here, but it could have some dangerous repercussions or could add fuel to a fire that's already burning. So we needed to find a way that we could kind of remove cultural reference bias from an assessment so that a country, another entity couldn't say, oh, look, this test reflects that our culture is better than yours. It just reflects that the population we tested is different than the population we tested in your culture. So any questions about that before then I'll make some. So in order to do that, we have played with kind of 3 different approaches, and some of them I think Laura will go into a little bit more depth on. The first is involving local subject matter experts in the test development itself. So right from the very beginning, having local people who are very familiar with the culture and even youth assist with the test development in terms of defining what competencies or what skills you're going to measure, and also in looking at the items that you develop to give their feedback on if those items, in their opinion, actually do make sense and do measure the thing that you're wanting to measure. The next thing we've worked with is cognitive testing. Sometimes people call these cognitive interviews. And for those, we sit down with a couple of youth. It's not a big sample. We sit down with those youth who are representative of the population of youth who will take our test, and we go through the test with them once it's developed, and ask them just to think aloud as they're reading the test, which is easier said than done, certainly, for most youth. But by having them think aloud as they read the questions, we can learn what is not making sense to them that made sense to us. Or if we thought we were measuring communication and they think we're talking about interpersonal skills, then we know we have to adjust that question because it's not meaning the same thing to them as it is to us. So it's been a really valuable part of adapting these tests to local context. And the third thing I want to talk about, and this is the one I want to focus on, is we played around with an item type, a question type called anchoring vignettes. Now, these are not something EDC invented. They have existed for a while in the world of test development. But we just played with them for this purpose. So an anchoring vignette is very simply a question that presents 3 different hypothetical people. And each person is described as having either a really high level of a skill, a mediocre level of a skill, or a really low level of a skill. And using these hypothetical people, we ask our test takers to tell us what levels of those skills they think those people have. And by anchoring their responses in these hypothetical people, we can, we think, it's hard to prove this, but lessen the effects of cultural reference bias. Now, it is going to be extremely difficult for you to challenge this approach or praise it without understanding the mechanics of it. So I'm going to, if it's okay, do a quick little activity that will hopefully help you to understand how anchoring vignettes actually work. So I have 4 people who really graciously volunteered. But that I mean they sat in the wrong place. So please feel free to challenge me if something's not making sense to you or something's not clear. But could I have it, so other than Emma, right? The 3 of you could just stand up and stand against the back wall. All right, so I have Lindsay, Atina, and Holly. And so let's pretend, thank you. Let's pretend that these 3 individuals are the 3 hypothetical people in my anchoring vignette about communication skills. So let's say I, the test developer, decide that Lindsay has terrible communication skills. So I'm going to write a little story about Lindsay and her poor communication skills. And then I'm going to decide, oh, well, Atina has mediocre communication skills. She's kind of in the middle. So I'm going to write a little story about Atina that, to me, the test developer, represents mediocre communication skills. And then I'm going to decide that Holly is a great communicator. And I'm going to write a little story about Holly that expresses what I think are great communication skills. On a 5-point, and I've rated them on a 5-point Likert scale. So then I have Emma, who is my test taker. Can you just kind of stand here? Now, Emma is going to do 2 things for me on the test. She is going to first, without seeing the test maker's ratings, she's going to give her ratings of these 3 hypothetical people. And the second thing she's going to do is rate herself. So this is where you'll start to see the mechanics and some of the benefits and drawbacks of this approach. So let's say, Emma, you decide that Lindsay is actually not very poor at communicating, she's just poor at communicating. And then you decide Atina is mediocre, so you're going to rate her as a 3. But you think Holly is actually not a great communicator. She's just a good communicator. Okay, so now she's rated these guys. Her ratings were a little different than mine, but that's okay. I'm trying to anchor her response and her perception of what the communication skills look like. So now the second step for her is to rate herself. So when Emma rates herself, she decides, oh, I am a great communicator. I am actually a 5. So she has said now, remember, I rated Holly as a 5. Emma has told me, oh no, I'm better than that. So I'm going to rescale her score so that she actually gets a higher score than a 5. And in this particular way of doing it, she would receive a 7. But I have now anchored her score in a reference point that everyone is going to see and rate. Does that make sense? The mechanics? Okay. Go ahead.
Do you have any way of validating where Emma actually is? I mean, that's one of the problems with self-assessments is oftentimes you don't do it, but this really does help because you have something to compare against. But if you haven't gotten any feedback on how you actually communicate, that's hard. So how do you kind of validate where Emma sees herself?
Well, actually, that's one of the drawbacks I was hoping you would pick up on by saying it all laid out to you, because we're anchoring it in her perception. Yeah. And if her perception is off, unless her perception is equally off for herself and others, which it probably isn't, then we don't know. But then we don't know for sure if we really aren't validating. We did add another question type to the test called situational judgment tests that are still a self-assessment, a self-report technically, but move a step away. They're a little harder to fake. And we were able to correlate our scores on those items with the anchored results from the self-report section to see if there was a correlation with them. And there was. So that gave us a little bit more confidence that this was working, because on the less fakeable part of the test, there was a relationship between those responses and these. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us just a little bit more about the situational and how they work? Because I think it's really interesting.
Yeah. You guys can probably get to town. I'm really grateful to you guys for
Thank you. They didn't have to communicate at all. We don't know.
So the situational judgment tests are a kind of handy little, also self-report question, and you might talk about this more too, Patrick.
Yeah, but please.
Okay, all right, I'll just explain the section of it. So a situational judgment test provides a little situation. So for example, you work at a bakery and your boss wants you to make a new cake that you've never made before and you have no idea how to make it. What will you do? And then it gives you five, any number, a few possible responses to that scenario. And you rate each of those responses according to which response you're most likely to have. And so while it's still a self-report, you're still saying, this is what I would do. It's harder to fake because we're putting you in a situation and asking you how you would respond. So it's harder to see, whereas the self-reports are really obvious, where you say, I like talking to people, and we can all figure out, oh yeah, I want to probably say yes to that if I want people to think I have good communication skills. And the situational test is a little hard to figure out which response is the best one. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, go ahead. So within a self-report, is it possible to have the trainer also rate the students to see and then compare that to their self-report?
Yes, it is, and we did something similar to that in the study that Making Sense, that YouthPower Learning funded through Making Sense, or vice versa. And we asked the employers and educators, actually they didn't rate the very students, but they rated an ideal version of the ideal student or the ideal employee using the exact same test, using this test I'm talking about today, so that we could then compare what you thought was important and what employers and educators thought was important. We have not yet done that to assess an individual student, but I don't see a reason why it couldn't be done.
And by the way, if you haven't seen the study that they did, it's kind of very interesting because they compared what the students thought about soft skills, and then they looked at what educators think about it, which soft skills are important. And then they looked at what the employers think are important soft skills, and then kind of looked at some of the gaps. So,
Can I also answer that question?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
So IYF has experimented with that trainer assessment tool as well with young people in their classes. And the thing is, it's just such a huge lift for the trainer to be able to do, particularly in classes that are up to 25 people, to ask a trainer to then, in addition to delivering the lessons and being that positive role model and all of those other aspects of their job that are so important, to then have the time to do that individual level documentation. While it sounds really great, in practice, it's kind of not feasible in our experience, except for if you have other sources of support in the classroom, such as co-trainers or coaches who can take that lens with more focus than the trainer themselves. But I'm happy to share that tool if you'd like to see it.
Actually, in the interest of time, did you have any?
Yes,
other?
no, that's
Yeah. Shall we switch? We'll have questions at the end also, if it's okay with you. Yeah. And then, so let's switch over to Lara and talk about how you approach.
Sure. Thank you so much, Maria. And I will say thank you, Rebecca, as well. And the work that EDC has done has really been an inspiration to IYF on our own journey over the years, and also just a great information source. So thank you. So like many of you in the room, International Youth Foundation has been looking for a robust and reliable way to measure soft skills for years, and we've experimented with a number of different approaches and tools. Those of you who do this kind of training will know firsthand what Daniel referenced in the brief, those difficulties of self-report items. So For example, how often do you show up for work on time? Or rate your listening skills. Every day and excellent. Great. Where are we now? And another difficulty is finding a tool that can be applied across different contexts. So we've used our Passport to Success life skills curriculum in over 50 different countries. So this is very important to us, and we see that it is for others as well. So we went looking for a better way to measure not only our own program outcomes, but hopefully for those for others in the field as well. So a lot of advances in psychometrics and non-cognitive testing have been made in recent years. In 2014, International Youth Foundation partnered with Professional Examination Services, which is now part of the American testing company ACT, which many of you probably remember from your college preparatory exams, to create a fully digital assessment of work readiness. The assessment includes situational judgment items, which Rebecca explained very well. I would add that there's a few different ways to approach the actual question part of the scenario. You can ask, what is the most effective response? You can ask, what should you do? Or what would you do? And each of these has slightly different schools of thought around the type of answer and validity that you're going to get there. Another approach that you can also take in situational judgment items, which our team at ACT has done, is to have subject matter experts from different locations also key and potentially re-key the responses so that you're always looking at what's effective, what's considered somewhat effective, somewhat ineffective in terms of that hypothetical response in the scenario. And sometimes you do have to do that re-keying based on data that you're seeing. The assessment also includes forced choice items, which present two or more equally socially desirable things. So I'm a good listener and I work well on a team. And then through analysis and over time of the assessment, you start to see through pattern analysis what is really most like the person who's taking the exam, as well as some limited bio data, like how often did you do something, and some self-report items. One difference in our approach is that for the development of this assessment, we convened a corporate advisory board to provide guidance at every step of the way in its development. So one of the key takeaways from the technical brief was that that diverse collaborative team is really needed to build an assessment with all of the right inputs and context for the problem that you're facing. So ultimately our goal, and at IYF it is to help young people to secure and keep meaningful employment, then we knew that we needed that employer input and voices at the table. So our corporate advisory board included members from Hilton, Cummins, Laureate, Chevron, Caterpillar, and others, so both multinational and national actors from different regions. And they reviewed items, so they looked at questions and gave us feedback. They took a critical eye to our pilot findings, and they're continuing to provide assistance on things like positioning and how we're talking about the tool so that it has resonance with employers too. So the online assessment will measure things like getting along with others, sustaining effort, acting honestly, maintaining composure, and other skills that are necessary for success in the workplace, particularly in that entry-level job space. We arrived at these skills by crosswalking with major frameworks like Hexaco, which is basically the Big Five taxonomy, but with the added element of integrity, which we were hearing from employers is very important and hard to measure and hard to find. ONET, Child Trends, etc. And then triangulating it further based on our own curriculum, but not just our curriculum, and the data from our global pilot. So we found that ensuring linkages to those established frameworks is a really important foundation for any tool of this nature. One thing that I'll say that may be provocative is that the assessment will measure the same competencies in all of the locations and countries in which it's used. Though we anticipate that the way that we'll look at performance norms, so comparing different groups, setting standards for high achievement, middle achievement, et cetera, will be analyzed both globally and then within countries or regions as well to have those different viewpoints and contexts. So as featured in the technical brief, and thank you for the opportunity to share that story both in the brief and today with you, we've done significant piloting of this assessment to ensure relevance in different contexts. So when we were first getting started and writing questions, or rather the psychometricians were writing questions, we field tested an initial batch of items with youth in South Africa to just make sure that we were on the right track with the situations that we were posing. And also to get some immediate user-driven feedback on things like the length of the test and access to technology and some of those user experience points that you also mentioned being important in the pilot process. Then in early 2017, we did a full pilot of the assessment in 6 countries: Mexico, El Salvador, South Africa, Jordan, Indonesia, and India. So this is an intentionally very diverse group of countries and also demographic profiles of young people who were involved. Many had completed our own Passport to Success program, but others had not. So a special thank you to Holly from Plan International USA, who participated in our pilot by fielding young graduates of their programs in El Salvador and Indonesia to sit for the assessment. We were looking at the strength of the items, the competency framework itself, and things like fairness. So our men and women scoring at approximately the same levels on the different constructs. And we ran into some really interesting differences between locations and definitely examples of cultural reference bias on our part. So I'll tell one story. For example, with situational judgment questions, one best practice when writing questions of this nature for young people who have potentially limited work experience or none at all is to include both work and school-based scenarios, and even sometimes in the community, because those are the settings that they're familiar with. Well, one strange question that somehow made it past our cultural screen involved you taking home 2 school hamsters to take care of, one of which ate the other. So what do? Do you buy a replacement hamster? Do you tell the truth? I don't know what you do in that situation. But I know that question did not work at all and was not understood by young people in India or Indonesia or a number of the other settings. Sorry. Right, like what's wrong with that? So it's been dropped from the test and I've been assured no more hamster questions will be on the operational form. So even though we consider ourselves to be experts in communicating in different contexts, and in that case, we had done translation and back translation to ensure understanding, it wasn't enough. So we have to take an additional critical eye to make sure the terms of reference are being understood and have meaning in those different settings. So you have to be open to testing your tools and then to improve based on failures and the data from the pilot and input from participants as well. So I'll go on a little bit of a soapbox here. So monitoring and evaluation is, of course, valuable for our programs, our donors, and our stakeholders. But what about for the young people we're assessing themselves? One kind of radical aspect of this tool is that it also presents value for the subject or candidate who's sitting for the tool. So the test will provide an easily understandable individual report that outlines a young person's areas of strength and also their areas for future development, so that they can point out those strengths to an employer in an interview and also seek further training to build in those areas that need improvement. We conducted focus groups in our pilot areas to get participant feedback. And in one that I did in Jordan, a young man said to me, "Will help an employer to know me. It will show him that I'm working hard to improve myself, that I'm taking the test, and that I have these skills." Another young woman in Indonesia said that the test helps me to recognize my inner self and understand my character more. So valuable for that personal developmental aspect as well. So I'd like to add to the theme of the technical brief that youth involvement should be part of the process, yes, but also central to the end goal as we develop tools to measure impact. This assessment is designed to be plug and play with soft skills and employability programs. So not just our own Passport to Success programs, but others as well. It will provide training institutions or NGOs with cohort reports that measure the impact of programs so they can be used in a pre and post manner, and also to compare different groups, even down potentially to the teacher or trainer level for quality assurance. And we hope that the data resulting from the assessment will eventually inspire young people will inspire employers to hire more young people who are work ready and likely to succeed, and that it will also inspire funders and others to invest more in training of this nature. Because we, and I'm sure many of you, have seen the transformative nature of training like this, and so it's such a struggle to be able to defend it with that proper evidence. So based on our pilot data and rigorous analysis by their psychometricians, ACT has some further revisions to the tests, including writing new items, which they're going to be testing further in the United States and Mexico in early 2018. IYF is excited to begin distribution of the assessment in about mid-2018. So the brief says early 2018, but I'm going to go ahead and say mid-2018 now. And we're looking for early adopters to use the test. So those initial use cases or purposes of the assessment will be formative and developmental for young people, so that window into what their strengths and areas for potential improvement are. Screening for employers and progress measurement from a program impact lens. So please reach out to myself or my IYF colleagues. Sharon is also here over here if you'd like more information. And then the last thing I'll say, because I'm pretty sure I've gone over time, is that once it's launched, it's not finished, it's not final. The data resulting from the use of the assessment in each of these different settings is going to be valuable for ongoing refinement. Because actually the work of validating a psychometric assessment is never complete. You're building it over time with more data, constant quality assurance checks, establishing those performance norms with actual people, and refining with continuing inputs from those key stakeholders like employers, like young people, like communities of practice of our peers that we respect. So thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
Fabulous. I think this was really. I think it's so easy to read some of these reports, adapting things, and it sounds so easy. And I think we've really brought it down to the level of what's really involved and how complicated and difficult it is. And I'll just start perhaps with one quick question for each of you, but in the meantime, please prepare your own questions. So for Rebecca, it would be interesting to know what you saw as the main value that came out of involving youth early on. And then I think for you, Lara, would be interested in understanding better what were the challenges with having a corporate advisory board. I'm sure there were lots of benefits, but were there also some challenges?
Sure.
Okay, so the main value of involving youth early on, well, a couple of things. We're working on a new test right now, and we are actually involving youth earlier on in terms of helping define what soft skills, what competencies we're actually going to measure. And that has been hugely helpful because we, and when I say we, I mean those of us who sit in our office in Georgetown, have a different idea of what's important than the youth and also the adults that work with them in these local contexts. That has been extremely important. The other value has been, and I think this speaks a little bit to something Laura was saying, though not completely, that when we involved our youth in looking in the cognitive testing of the test and looking at the test with us before we were ready to roll it out and giving us feedback on it, it is a bit of an empowering thing. We don't often sit down with them and say, hey, we want your input on what's happening and what we're going to roll out to your peers. So I think that is a really meaningful value. But it's with a very small group of youth that we do this because it does take a lot of time to do cognitive testing and to do it well. So the other value really is the quality of the test in that context. And as Maria alluded to earlier, we in one instance with one of our soft skill assessments implemented it in Manila in secondary schools and also in Mindanao with out-of-school youth. You may not think you know Mindanao, Philippines, but you probably heard about it in the news almost a year ago when ISIS took over a town there. So it's that region. So very conflict affected, not just ISIS affiliates, but family feuds, like small groups that are taking advantage of the situation. So Manila secondary schools versus conflict affected Mindanao. And we had to redo the cognitive testing for Mindanao, and we wanted to roll it out there because the context was so different the youth's perspectives were so, had the potential to be so different from their, the other youth in Manila, even though it was the same country. So that has been really helpful to make sure the test is working well in all these different contexts that we're implementing it.
Great.
Do you want to follow up to that?
Or
just another question?
Yeah, okay. Then
Sure, we will remember you. So two challenges come to mind, and the question was, what are the difficulties with working with a corporate advisory board on something like this? And the first is that, these are our current or past or prospective donors of International Youth Foundation. And so relationship management is obviously very important. And so when we have faced challenges along the way, it's an ongoing struggle of how much information do you share, and then how are you positioning their input points in a way that's constructive and they feel like they're adding value, and that isn't sort of like in name only. So we've looked for those real ways that they can engage and provide that like critical feedback, but also keeping in mind like that these are our key stakeholders for our organization, for our existing youth development programs that are way beyond this assessment. And then the second, and this is a related point to the diverse collaborative team, and it's maybe like a challenge associated with that, is that psychometricians, data scientists, NGO program people, corporate HR, these are all very different languages of communication, speaking of soft skills, and points of reference, and where these groups see value and seek value. And so in particular, bridging between like the corporate HR, CR perspective and the scientific perspective, and encouraging scientists to see the value of corporate input, has been an ongoing piece of work that IYF has had to act as the bridge between those two constituents for us.
Fabulous. And now we had a question in the back from Shelby.
Thank you. I was wondering if in both situations how the process took into account sort of gender normative differences on soft skills, and what's expected of boys versus girls, or men versus women. And then the second part is sort of age differences as well on a developmental level. What we can expect from certain age groups within the youth category.
And perhaps let's take another question.
I'll wait.
Okay. All right. Any other short question?
I kind of adding to that, I'd be curious if it kind of builds off of that of literacy levels and how those assessments were done with a range of literacy levels, or if you can do some of like the IOS assessment with somebody with a lower literacy level impact of it.
Sure. So good questions. And so our decisions to put the assessment fully online and have it be a written assessment in that modality mean that it's not for everyone, and it's not for low literacy populations or people without any kind of digital or online skills. So in answer to your question is it can't be, and that's why we are still using some of our other tools. We're looking at other methods and still engaging with young people facing those particular barriers in different ways. So it's not a one size fits all solution in any way. But we're also kind of philosophically taking the position that in many instances, a modicum of digital skills are really necessary for success in many workplaces. There's a recent study by Brookings that shows that the level of digital skills required by all occupations has increased in the last 15 years, but that the biggest increases have been in low and middle skill jobs, which is really telling. And that's based on the US labor market, but it's prescient for others in many ways, telling of the writing on the wall. And I know UC maybe has done some interesting work on low literacy, so I'll let you tackle that too. But on the gender piece, that was one key measure of equity that we were looking for in our pilot analysis, is even down to the question level, how were young men and young women faring? And in some instances, young women were doing much better on different constructs and in different questions. And in some instances, that wasn't the case. So we'll be taking a hard look at those questions and do they require revision and further writing? Do they get removed from the test, et cetera? So that's a key lens for us as we move towards the operational version of the assessment.
Similarly, we looked at how different items functioned differently for males and females. So it's a differential item functioning test, which I believe is probably exactly the same thing that Case did. So we did look at that to make sure that the items worked fairly across different groups. As far as literacy goes, we knew so situational judgment tests do require a pretty good degree of a pretty high level of literacy for a lot of our populations, not just because of the words used, but because of it's not just about can you read this word, but can you string these ideas together. So going into it, we knew we could only implement it with a group of youth who had a fairly high level of literacy. And when I say fairly high, I know that's vague, but for the group of youth that we work with, we knew we couldn't, the youth who take our literacy programs, we knew this test wasn't for them. Something we have not yet done that we are trying to figure out how to do is to implement our soft skills tests alongside a literacy test, because they should not be correlated. The results the score should not be correlated if you're not actually testing literacy on your soft skills assessment. So that is something that is kind of on our list of next steps with the tests that we work with, because these tests aren't, the moment you move, maybe this is a little unfair, so please feel free to challenge me on this, but I think the moment you move away from the simple self-report, you immediately encounter that, okay, this is a more complex question, certainly requires more complex analysis, also requires more complex thinking on the part of the respondent. And that may not always be true, that may be a little bit too extreme of a statement, but I think in many cases it is.
I think it's really exciting to have this in-depth thought about what it takes to measure these things across such different contexts. I'd like to hear your reflections and also give my own on the issue of homogenization that's raised through all these endeavors. And I think for me, both on the cultural side and on the personality side. First, on the cultural side, I think it's really good and interesting that you use the example of communication to show us what the anchored vignette looks like, because I think that our definitions of good communication are extremely different across culture, and I'd like to hear more about what you learned about that. For example, I'm a dual citizen, Rwandan and American, and I lived in Rwanda for 10 years, including being married to a Rwandan, knowing that in Rwanda, good communication involves things like nuance, diplomacy, hiding fault, saving face, and not talking in many instances, which is very different from how a Western culture might define good communication. So how does that come? Were you able to adapt your assessment, discover that, and adapt it to match that? Because fitting in a Rwandan workplace requires different kinds of communication skills. On the personality side, and I've talked with Shireen also about my concern about the use of the BFI, because to me, it is about a particular set of personality characteristics that I wouldn't want everyone in the world to reflect, because we would lose out a lot in our workplaces if everybody had only that type of personality across those 5 measures. And I think the inclusion of integrity is really interesting because it's different. Everyone could develop integrity, and we're not losing a kind of introverts. We're not losing the introverts. We're not losing people who are not agreeable, but because they're not agreeable, they push forward an important idea that others don't agree with. But we hear from them because they're willing to be disagreeable for that. So I think I'd really like to hear more about that and have us not forget that issue when we're starting to measure things globally, where in fact we don't want everyone to be the same. So how can we account for that in the way that we are reporting these assessments?
and even though there's self-reports we give to young people, I wouldn't want to give a young person the impression that they haven't met an ideal standard that may not be their unique contribution to the world. Go first on the BFI and communication piece.
Okay, so I'll start talking about the BFI quickly. Let me give you a little bit of the history of the BFI, of what I know of it. And I'm not an expert here, so there's more reading to be done. But the BFI essentially is based in the English language and in English language dictionaries. So it was constructed by a psychologist who went through a dictionary and took out all the words that had to do with personality or qualities or skills or traits, and made a list of them, and then boiled them down into 5 categories, the big 5 categories. So it is very much based in the English language, and we all know how language and culture interact with each other. So I want to say that it is based in the English language. And while we are doing a lot of, I think, really good work to adapt it to other contexts, we do have to remember that it is based in a Western system of thought as comprised in the English language. So I want to say that. The other thing I want to say, though, is that there is good evidence that these 5 traits are not things that you are born with and then you're done, but that they are traits that you can develop. Here's a silly little example from my own life. I am completely an introvert. You could probably tell that by looking at me when you walked in the door. There's no question about it. The last time I took the Myers-Briggs, and I'm not trying to bring in another test, so we can leave that out of mention. I rated as an extrovert, and I was really not trying to fake the test. We all know, we talked about fakeability. And I was in grad school, and I was talking to the career counselor, and said, I know I'm not an extrovert, but I answered all the questions honestly, and I came across as an extrovert. And we had this conversation about being a learned extrovert and all this stuff. But the more I've learned about this field, the more I've just realized I have learned that in a work setting, in a professional setting, I have got to communicate well. And I've got to learn, even though my best way of communicating is on paper, I've got to learn how to do that orally. And I've got to learn how to be social with someone I haven't met before in a professional setting. I've got to learn those things. So I think that's the other kind of bad rep that the BFI gets, that whole system of thinking, that these are traits you're born with and they can't change. And if you don't have them, you're going to score really poorly on this, and that's it, you're done. Because I do think there are traits that you can learn. And I know that there's a lot of opinion around that statement that I just made. So if you have a different opinion, very valid still. But I do think actually, I think that's my worst soft skill after taking the test right now.
That's really great. Thank you. Thank you for the sophisticated question that was illustrative on many points for others in the room as well. So not just as to solicit information, but also to impart it. So a couple of things that brought up for me. So I would wholeheartedly agree that a lot of these traits are mutable and can be changed with training and dedication, particularly so with conscientiousness and agreeableness. So from that big 5, and there's research backing that up that I can certainly share afterwards. So that's part of it. It's not just a personality assessment of where are you and here's where you always will be. And in fact, in many regions of the world, there's a lot of sensitivity around personality assessments as a further mechanism for discrimination for already marginalized groups. So South Africa comes to mind. So this is an issue that we've been really aware of and sensitive to, and will frankly require further study and guidance from experts in that country. The other thing that comes to mind from your question is that, so let's say within communication, if that's the construct, then what are those other facets or sub-constructs that are feeding into it? So one may be listening, one may be assertiveness, and someone may do better within listening than they do within assertiveness because they are more on that introvert side, yet they're still presenting with a high level of communication skills because of their aptitude in the first area. So making sure that within a framework, there's enough nuance and substantiation of that full construct that what feeds into it is also reflective of the full range of human experience and skill.
I think we'll take one more question and then we'll have to jump into the next item. Yes.
Hi, I'm sorry I was late. I'm Bonnie Polis, and I'm a consultant in youth development world. So this is really exciting, again, over the years. This is a wonderful place to be with all this new data coming out. So I have one observation and one question. So you went back and forth a lot between using the word test and assessment. And I'm not a researcher, so I'd just love to know if those really equate with each other, because I know I would feel more comfortable taking an assessment versus feeling there's a test and there's a right and wrong answer. And I think language is really important. And how young people hear that and how people in systems hear this about what they're going to maybe try to implement is whether there is a right or wrong or we're looking at a scale. So that's just a question. And then the other thing is, while what's great is in terms of the focus of this is such really meaningful engagement of young people from the very beginning. I also wonder, as our programs only last for a certain number of years, from the very beginning, are the systems involved in this process, the workforce system, the education system, as participants to be learning about this, because they are going to be left, right, with whatever we're learning about this to implement in their own country. So are we really thinking about how this is going to be impacting systems, even if we don't have the right answers yet? But for them to be a part of discussions like this in their own countries about what's going to work based on growing research base. So those are topics.
So I think I've made you go first a lot, so so the correct word is assessment. I just get tired of saying the same thing over and over again. So yes, you're absolutely right. Language has power, and particularly for that formative use case where it's providing developmental feedback, it's important that it be termed an assessment and not a test, because there's not a wrong answer, so to speak, though there are less effective answers. So thank you for that. And secondly, maybe one important clarification on the systems level question is that this assessment won't be open source, so it's not something that we would leave behind without an ongoing relationship with an entity. We are facing that challenge and opportunity in other places with our Passport to Success curriculum. So we are in conversations with the Jordan TVET system to allow them license to continue to use the curriculum for perpetuity, and a few other countries that I'm looking at Sharon to fill in where that's also Tanzania. So in places where we have a large footprint and a big program, but it won't last forever, to your point, we are leaving that legacy and that build capacity of the curriculum. But because with the assessment, so the digital modality choice offers a lot of value in that reporting becomes instantaneous, right? You don't have to have a statistician on your team to be able to read and analyze the results. So it's easy, user-friendly in that sense. But because of that, there are costs each time that a candidate sits for the assessment and that report is generated. So just in terms of a business model, that's not necessarily a feasible proposition at this point in time. That said, obviously, this is something we've been working on for 3 years. We're now looking forward to launch in 2018, but the path ahead is a wide open canvas. And so that may yet be an avenue that we go down with, in particular, that technical vocational partner angle, as we do work in those contexts in many settings. We're just not there yet, and we haven't cracked that nut.
Can I just add to that?
Yes, please.
I think in terms of the system, because this is a soft skills assessment meant for work readiness, and I think that the purpose that you pointed out before, Daniel and Maria, in your introductions, I think is very important. And so I mean, in this case, the system, if you will, if you want, maybe think of it on a slightly smaller scale, it would be the employers themselves.
Labor
These labor, as sort of representatives of the labor market in general. And so I think that's where there has been involvement, at least. I think Laura spoke to the challenges of that involvement, but I think that's one piece that we can kind of say, to a certain extent, we're sort of checking that box to make sure that this is something that would be useful for employers as a tool to look at young people a bit differently, to screen them, to potentially measure their own programs of work readiness.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. And Sharon is our director of commercialization and product management, so she is also a great resource for you if you have questions about our approach with the WRA, particularly in the coming year.
Great. Thank you.
Do you mind if I'll be quick?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the things that Laura and Sharon touched on are really helpful. And one of the things you brought up was test purpose. And one of the things I've learned from working with these assessment developers and psychometricians is that a test has to be validated for every purpose you intend it to serve. And not every test can be validated for every purpose that you would want it to serve. So for example, EDC has 2 soft skills assessments, and we're working on a third because the other 2 don't fulfill the purpose that we want the third to fill. And the purpose of the third tool, the one I'm currently working on, is basically institutionalization, what you're talking about, is to provide a tool to teachers in secondary schools who have institutionalized already our curriculum, much as you guys are doing. And now we want to provide them with a tool that they can deliver to their students and that they can score. And that one, we are being much more proactive about involving the Ministry of Education and the teachers in the local schools themselves, because the purpose of that test really is for us to leave that test with them. But yeah, it's all about the test purpose. So I will stop there, except I just want to mention really quickly that photo was taken by one of, I'm right? It was taken by one of the youth in the Making Sense YouthPower Learning funded project that EDC implemented a while ago, and she took that photo. That's Hunter. She took it as part of her expression of what soft skills in action look like to me. So I just want to give Cindy a little call out. That's really cool.
Thank you. This was really fabulous. Thank you, Daniel, for spearheading that paper. I think it was really great, you and your team, to take that on, all the contributions from the community of practice. And Rebecca and Lara, wonderful discussion, really appreciate it. And I'm sure we look forward to a lot more discussions and work in that field. And so before we go into the next activity, perhaps just a few words about the briefs that the communities of practice are developing, because it impacts a little bit of next year's goals and activities. So just to say kind of that these briefs are not developed with 500 hours of input of somebody that sits somewhere is dedicated to this. It's really a community of practice product. And so it is lighter touch, it's not a lot of research. So as you're thinking perhaps about next year, what's always helpful too is if somebody already has some kind of approach or something that they would like the community, for example, to validate and to expand on, or just something as input into that next process. So think of it kind of light touch, short, and something that is obviously valuable for the community.
Yeah, I'm thinking of it as an amplifier, a sort of consolidator, is how we see a role in the COPs and the sort of lighter touch, singular person investments that are there. That this is a community that's relatively a ground up type of approach, and so if there are things that people are excited about and wanting to connect around, we can help organize that, but we want it to be from the community and valuable to you.
Which is perfect, because that's actually our next activity. Is starting to think through that as we looked at one of the cornerstone activities from 2017 of really taking some of that attention into 2018 and what are some of those topics that we want to be talking about as a community and really be looking in and for our webinars, our briefs, and our activities there. So to do this, we're actually going to use some old school technology and some new school technology. So if you are sensitive of your data, please do log on into your Wi-Fi on your phone. But we are going to start out by getting on to Mentimeter and taking a couple of quizzes and answering some questions here. So this is where you go to the website and then you put in the code of it. And we're going to answer some questions to hear everybody's opinion and really get our brains start to be thinking about 2018. And for those of you who are online and listening in, please follow the website link as well.
For this first one, everybody I think has figured out that you just need to put in some quick terms of what the value of the COP is to you, and then we'll see what we get out of it. So maybe we can pause here and just take a look at what I think everybody's had a chance to submit the first question. So we see networking coming up big, which is why we left some time at the end for folks to network with as well. I think we've seen that this is a big thing that people really care about, and so that's also helpful feedback for us. Learning, different versions of learning and knowledge coming up big, new perspectives, information, thoughtful discussion. So this is super helpful, and we hope there are people online submitting too, but let's move on to the next one.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So this next one is just to get a sense of which activities you guys value the most. I think you have to choose one. I may not have made the setting this my favorite, so you have to really
Think hard about it.
think hard about which one you like the most.
I love the real time.
Wow, so in-person meetings are really.
Yes, I mean, we're all.
Why you should get assessment people together.
I mean, there's a bias. There's a bias in our approach.
We will be sending another polling out to the other 450 members who are not here to get some of their feedback as well.
So nobody ventured out to pitch another activity for us. And finally, one more, just to get our brain full.
Very concise here.
You do.
Yeah.
Impact
evaluation, SEL. Yeah. Great. So a lot of different things that are really coming in and that we're really talking about here, and what we're looking and how we're looking to engage with. So I want us to take these words that are up on, so everybody got them in? Cool. Because it will continue to change, but that's okay if it does continue to change. I want us to take these words and to really kind of think about this is what we're talking about, this is what we're interested in. We're going to break into some small groups and we're going to go old school technology and use some large sticky notes and some markers. And we're going to break these out into what we think are really some of those key nuggets that we as a community practice need to be talking more about. They might be some of the hot topics that are out there and need further research or further discussion, or they might be some of those things that we're not yet talking about, but we should be talking about. So if we can quickly just kind of break into groups of maybe 4 people sort of at the table joining in, we're going to get some sticky notes. And there's also some good things in the basket to help you squeeze on something or twist something around to get those juices flowing as need be. All right, so let me grab the sticky notes here. And if we could come up with maybe a maximum of 5 per group of what you think we should be talking about in 2018.
And I think one thing to think about too is, I think this topic for the technical brief that we talked about today is a good example of how narrow we can get. We can talk about gender as a topic, but also are there any particular questions within gender and about gender that you're curious about in regards to skills? Sectoral skills and impact and program implementation. Thinking about those topics, but also trying to narrow down a little bit to specific questions.
And we're going to give you about 5 minutes to do some brainstorming on it. So really think through what you guys want. Could you reiterate the question?
Oh, thank you.
Yes. So using the words up here of what we've already started to use as a filter through, start to think more specifically, what are those questions? What are those specific topics that we should really be thinking about and addressing and taking on in 2018 as a community of practice?
So one way to also think about it is, like, what questions have you faced in your current work that you really wish we could apply community to? That we could create a brief for, or we create a webinar for. And those are definitely some guiding terms, but it might be more.
I'm wondering if it might be helpful just to at least share the learning agenda concepts.
Sure.
Is it sort of are you going to do that next?
We were going to do that afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can maybe move around a little bit. All right.
So gender obviously is sort of sitting there in the middle, and I think one of the things
Does anyone have a really good
so be able to connect around is thinking about for empowering the barriers to
one idea
I think about setting those
like 5 on 1.
really thinking about so that review process of the concepts of
So what did you do?
that are providing I thought it was
sticky years.
that are then working to address so just the communities work with it. So there's a little bit of based on that is something that's so tangible.
So I'm going to
Yeah, I mean, do you want to write that down? I'm not sure I'm capable of writing that in next word. Well, yeah. No, I was just thinking that, I mean, you mentioned the fact that these communities also can serve, or take a role as a little bit of capacity building. So those, children, applicants, we haven't discussed that. That's a great idea. I mean, we will have just discussed about the distribution, the word of mouth, I guess that's and I think, and I think that's where it's this is where an individual's or an organizational forest is that with the right place, where we're in serving organizations globally, and whether building out resources, doing mentoring, doing various activities that there would be a dual interest, right? So an organization that's working in that space and connects with could be a valuable connection, something that could be very interesting.
Right? So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to think about how. I guess it's more sort of an activity. I guess.
Yeah, no,
I mean, it's not sort of asking for like a question, but I think it's sort of more of a suggestion of a way in which.
Yeah, it is very like knowing other parts of it are happening.
Yeah, right, yeah. So now I will step out and hear you guys talk about what would be important to focus on you guys as members. Yeah. We'll let you finish your thought there. I support the grants here, is it? Ahead of the. Well, I think it's both. Both? Yeah, I mean, we will share out for people to do service reviews for grants. That call I know. And I think downstream, that's what you're supporting. And there's different ways of providing support, marketing to, those organizations that become part of as well. And giving them a platform for sharing what it is that work.
Doing lessons, doing
That's a very logical COP. Along the gender. Right, exactly,
And you'll be,
Here's an opportunity.
Well, that's smart. All sorts of things that she figures out
Very what are some of the most effective ways to build the capacity of the facilitator and the to be providing this imparting soft skills and teaching, modeling, but doing that training and capacity building in the most sort of time efficient way. We spend a lot of time whenever we roll out a program. That's 4 full days with our teachers and our facilitators. And we're kind of coming up against it's just incredibly costly and it's incredibly time consuming for these organizations. I think a lot of them would like to find a way to do that in a shorter time frame. And so for me, I'm curious to know what are some examples of ways that you can make it the last initial touch point that also doesn't sort of require tons and tons of touch points thereafter. Sort of like I'm not looking for like sort of like a bit of a holy grail question, but if you if you spend a day with a teacher up front, are you going to have to spend
about a 2-minute warning,
a full week worth of follow-up later on? I'm just trying to think about what are some of the ways to more effectively spend time with the right teachers to get at the lasting change and transfer of knowledge related to soft skills. So I don't know if that's dealing with that or that's a concept. I didn't understand that. It's something that we've been thinking about. And when you're talking about the example of doing a blended training of trainers, which has I think done the results of that study also haven't been able to get an impact evaluation to like figure that out. So I guess maybe that's maybe my question is there an opportunity to look at there be some type of evaluation to kind of validate that approach maybe as a work being done as a because we just have so much less experience with that. We've done it, the evidence in language, should just be a way that across other very centric of my organization, but I'm not sure if that's
no, I think I wish to see if we could do an impact evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, it's not we could do it, but like I don't know, what's some way to like
having kept it balanced.
It's very like
of course,
so you can have a webinar series or a webinar or an in-person session looking at, okay, let's talk about, women learning themselves, training modalities, and skills. So how do you equip those that are working with you to
what would you want to know your bias?
So maybe something just focused around that from a learning side, and then creating that call to action. Like, here's what we need next.
Right.
So that would be
the scope, much more scope of this. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you for helping me kind of. Okay. So that.
So you could do some sort of learning around, because it could be whatever, but learning around training models. For learning best practices. Is it improper consistency again?
About 1 minute, so please wrap up your thoughts and get them on to sticky notes.
Best practices without them necessarily being relevant best practices, or are these just really,
It's a mixture. Promising practices.
Promising practices. Well, because I come from the corporate world, and everything that any company does is like a best practice. So it's just like everybody's like, it's a best practice. And I'm like, it's useless, and the humility that this sector has. You come from the corporate world where everybody's like, I make nice coffee. I make nice coffee. I think there's some actual objectivity inserted here.
The virtual Facebook Live, Twitter Live.
Oh, you're what would you add over while you're doing that? Is there something
I have been hearing a lot, and I don't know if it's at USAID and also could be just because of the focus of one of the strategies in countries in crisis and conflict about is social learning, and I wonder if there is a way to kind of like see what is the overlap between soft skills and things of that easier.
Oh yeah, I think they do a lot.
All right, is everybody wrapped up?
Yes, always like to do that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'm just gonna run to the restroom. Thank you, ladies. Pleasure working with you.
All right, we want to hear back from everybody about what you guys talked about and what you think are the promising topics for us to be taking on as a community of practice. So we're gonna ask each team to report back with what you communicated. And as we report back, we're gonna stick them up on that wall, hoping that the post-it notes stick on the fabric wall. If not, we're gonna get some tape to help us out with that. Is there a team that wants to go first? Wants to kind of go through and the list of what they've got. You guys do? All right, Jackie.
And by the way, it's a rolling bathroom break, as you probably know. So somebody needs to go.
So we're all relatively new to this space, and so one of the things that we thought was pretty impressive in terms of what this community practice could do is it brings together, capitalizing on the community itself, the community members. We have small organizations in rural Uganda, and we have large USAID implementing bodies. So we talked about if you're wanting to break into the youth sphere, or maybe you're already there, what are those industry standards and what are those best practices and what yes, we know that everything is different in every context, but what are some things that are kind of universal and what are the basics that everyone in youth development should know. And so that was, I think, did I capture that correctly?
No, okay.
Yeah. We also talked a little bit about, what does the utilization of these soft skills look like? After a young person has these soft skills, what does that mean for them in their future, and what does that look like after they've gone to these these trainings and these assessments, and they've gone from IYF to EDC and to plan, and they've done all these different assessments. What does that look like, and what could that look like in their future? Are they incentivized to be going to these different trainings, or are they incentivized to go into the workforce, and are they ready for the workforce, and just making sure that final kind of connection is there between supply and demand. And then again, this was potentially because of our being kind of new here, but again, we recognize that there's a nuance in every context, but again, kind of similar to our first thought is, what is the profile of youth, and what are the young people, when we talk about, for example, in our technical brief, were we talking, 14 to 25, or are we talking 10 to 35, or, and just kind of understanding the main group that we're looking at when we're looking at youth, but then also understanding within that, label of youth, that there are many subcategories. Can I get it all?
Perfect. So those are some good topics for us to think about. Get those on up. Who wants to go next? Which is the next group? All eager?
Yeah,
sure.
I'll start. You guys can jump in. Sure. So the first thing we talked about was program design for conflict-affected youth, and then we talked also about how psychosocial and socio-emotional learning and trauma and mental health and resilience, how all those things interact with the soft skill discussion we're having and affect youth in conflict-affected areas.
Yeah.
The next thing, would you talk? This was your idea, that's good.
We were talking about whether we could share discussion of each other's curricula or apply the research that was recently done about pedagogical principles to our own curricula and discuss in what ways we find those principles to be relevant or difficult to apply, etc. And that led to the question of whether we could also do demonstration lessons or site visits, which came up later, or virtual site visits.
And I think, just to add, for those who haven't used those tools before, many or most of them, I think, are proprietary. So it's hard to actually see them. So that's why I think that was particularly useful.
And it would be fun.
Also along the lines of fun, we talked about like social events. Or like virtual, or like a site visit, even in DC, or virtual ones through Facebook Live to organizations, offices in other countries, or other parts of this country. We also talked about a longer conversation around the question that Katie asked around culture and homogenization, because that could really be a 2-hour discussion, not a 10-minute. And then we talked a little bit about having a discussion about how we genderize our M&E tools, how we make the question more gender sensitive. So not just like, does this item function differently for males and females, but how can we make this question more gender sensitive? And the last, the last,
what is it?
how are we sharing with the broader community in the field?
Yeah, so that was just a question Maria raised about, like, she likes the webinars because it brings in people who aren't just in DC. So how are we also taking these good ideas out to the field? And so that's where the virtual site visit came up, and ideas like that to leverage technology to build community, not just here. Yeah.
Great. Perfect. All right, and we're gonna go with the glass wall. Fabric sticking up somewhere. All right, another team. I think we've got a couple more out there. Yep.
We are actually, in some ways, echoing this group here. We brought up the intersection around soft skills, social emotional learning, and that conflict and crisis environment. So that was one of the sort of topical areas broadly. So a reflection there. And then Shireen had even brought up around thinking on curriculum, but kind of take one step back. How are we equipping those that would be imparting that curriculum?
Yeah.
So how are you what are the various modalities, strategies, scaffolding approaches to trying to get this a little lighter touch, right? Not the intensive, like 3 weeks, we're going to train, we're going to be back next month, and, and that continual follow-up, but how do we have multiple modalities and what's working? So kind of getting a better sense from the broader field and discussing through possible strategies. And then I'll let Olga sort of just bring up a very pragmatic concept of just a very specific activity for a prize that USAID will be working with YouthPower Learning on that's really relevant to this community of practice.
Olga, before you get started, just really quick, because we're going to do some voting in a moment. Okay. So as we've got some overlap, so which ones are overlapped?
So we have it here. These two are sort of overlapped with what that group has already shared.
And you think that they're overlapped with program design for conflict affected youth, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Because that's on a big sticky note, I'm just simply going to do this so that we don't end up voting 2 different places. And then
Well, maybe just add program design here though, because I think we didn't.
Okay, add program design, and then FEL.
So they focused on the curriculum side, when they mentioned it, curriculum review and evaluation, and we were a little bit focused on thinking of the training side. So how do you equip people?
Okay.
So slightly different, but there's an intersection.
Of it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so from
I can see building blocks of
Yeah. So that team, do you guys think that kind of covers that? Are they merged together or no? They're different.
They're different.
They're different. Okay, we'll leave them up as different then. Okay, perfect.
And then in the third
and the other one, as Cassandra mentioned, we are gonna launch a prize competition in February that is gonna focus on solutions for barriers for women economic empowerment. So we were discussing kind of like the roles or that this community of practice can take into that prize. So one is just helping us do the PR of the prize, but maybe review some of the applications and maybe provide mentorship to the grantees that are selected or some of the applicants that actually do not get selected but are probably promising. So what we are trying to do is identify youth-led organizations that not necessarily get funded by USAID. So we know that most likely they're going to need some capacity building. So maybe that is also a role that this community of practice can play.
Perfect. Excellent. 2 more teams. Let's hear from you guys.
So we also had some overlaps with these 2 groups. One was looking at the impact of trauma and being a little bit more sensitive to the way that we are engaging youth who experience trauma or toxic stress, and then coupling that also with violence prevention, so trying to do dual work with both primary and secondary prevention, especially conflict settings, gang violence, that kind of thing. Another point, so sort of putting the principles of youth engagement into practice. One was how we measure youth engagement. Another was involving youth not only within their communities, but then in the programmatic design, and then making sure that youth engagement is not only sort of symbolic and chauvinistic, but how to sort of incorporate a meaningful youth engagement. And then the third topic we talked about was sort of how to continue knowledge sharing. So similar to social events, whether there are more opportunities for sort of groups to grow organically outside of the meetings that are happening within the Washington, D.C. space. And then the potential of having a Q&A feature on the Google group. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I don't know if there are like some settings on the back end that we can talk apart from this, but it might enable like, you know, more of like a Q&A list rather than like a form. Something like that might make it more accessible for people that ask questions.
Awesome. I'd love to mention for the youth engagement in particular, there's a youth engagement community of practice that some of you might be members of, and that community of practice has been working on measuring youth engagement in particular. And so if there are people who are excited about that as a specific topic, we actually are looking for a couple people who are like, yes, I really do want to be jumping into that space because there's been some momentum, but it's slightly stalled. And so we would love to have some people who would like to champion that more dialogue around that because there's been a fair bit of work they've done already. So.
So we talked about showing evidence of impact and impact at scale, particularly around systems change, both in the private and public sector. So as a community, we could do that through a survey of people who have been involved in systems change, either implementers, government, and private sector, and we're working a webinar with these people. We talked about how you can really institutionalize some of these techniques and sort of the idea of sectoral youth development, and then linking experiences that of what we know in high-income countries like the U.S. and sort of similar situations that we see in low-income countries, and how we can learn from both places.
Fabulous. I will take that as well. All right, so these are some really good brainstorming of, you know, what are some possibilities, what do we need to be talking about as a community of practice, and we're already seeing that there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of consensus that's in the room. To help us kind of narrow this down and to really see what's hot and where our consensus is, we are going to do some very technical voting. There are stickers inside your box, and they are torn into 3. Oh, you guys are this. Go ahead and grab one that has got 3 on them. You get 3 votes. 3 votes. They only get 3 votes, so don't take 2 of them off with you, and there's no voting fraud going to be happening in here, all right? So with your 3 votes, go ahead and put them on those things that you think are the most appealing to you, the most relevant to the community, and that you would like to see, whether if it's in a webinar or a technical brief or information share out there, but just really what are the most important to you. So use your 3 votes, come on up, stick them on up there, and
I'm voting on my way out. Thank you. Really appreciate it. I didn't know who made it before, but I realized after I introduced myself. No, I don't know. Great. Thank you so much. Yes, you will.
So as you're voting, I also want to point out that Rebecca was kind enough to bring some material about some of their work and the tools. So on your way out, if you want to grab one.
For sure. We're losing. For sure. Oh no, we're losing votes here. Losing people. See here, this is this one.
Yeah. I can.
Yeah.
And we can also just.
Getting a last few votes on up there. All right, perfect. So it looks like we're definitely getting some consensus around some areas that are hot topics for many people, as we can see where our stickers are starting to form. So it looks like there's a lot of consensus around FEL and some of the conflict areas, and here, impact of trauma and conflict, violence prevention. It looks like there's a lot around the curriculum review on evaluation in light of kind of the lessons and demos, and tell us a little bit more about it. Social events, that's definitely, I think that's also over here, and another one as well, of people wanting to be able to see and see how this is really looking elsewhere. I think some of the other big ones is the prize grant, really wanting to be able to hear more about it, because Olga stepped on out. And what are the learnings and promising practices around facilitation, teaching modules for soft skills in person? How do we actually do it?
Modalities.
Modalities, sorry, thank you. As I look at it very quickly as I walk away. Perfect. So, we're losing some of the books out there. We will get a picture of it beforehand. But this is really informative to us as we start to think about 2018 and what is it that's important to us as a community to be able to be talking about. This is really helpful for information, and we will be pairing it. We'll also be sending out a forum via Google Form for those who are not here in person, so that their voice is also heard, the other 450 people who are part of the community. And we'll be, looking back and forth of what are we saying in person and what are other people saying back, of what are those really important items for us to be digging into, and using that to inform our upcoming webinars and our technical briefs for next year. With that, thinking about how we fit as a community practice into some of the larger activities of YouthPower, I would like to turn it on over to Cassandra to hear about the learning agenda. And I know we've got a couple minutes left.
I think we're sort of out of time, so I don't want to keep you unnecessarily. But I do have a couple, so I've printed out a little bit of just where we are. So we're working on a learning agenda for the sort of broader community and thinking about positive youth development. So it's not like our learning agenda, it is trying to set a learning agenda for positive youth development, and particularly thinking about the low and middle income country context. So we're trying to build off of other learning agendas. As most of you probably know, we did a systematic review earlier this year and looked at what do we know, what don't we know, and trying to build from there. So we've outlined, based on that review and some early consultations that we've undertaken, what might be the straw man version of that learning agenda and some key buckets and topical areas. And we want to engage the communities around kind of ground truthing this and talking about where are our opportunities for contributing to such an agenda. So I will leave it at that and share this with you, and just sort of think of it as an early teaser for we would be reaching back out to all of you. So I'm just gonna go around.
And I think that that's a great kind of insight if this really does fit into a larger learning agenda, larger things that are happening. Cassandra, thanks for earlier kind of giving a shout out to some of the other community practices that are happening. And there's a lot of different ways of getting engaged, being involved, and really of learning what's out there. Yes.
I'm going to be sending out a tool to the listserv, and I brought a few copies here. Also, just internally, World Learning took this recent YouthPower research on soft skills development and assessment, and we turned it into some practical tools that our curriculum developers in different countries, our program designers, people who are writing proposals, they can use these tools to make sure that what they're designing aligns with what we know. So we developed it internally, but then I thought maybe it could be relevant for other people, so we put it under a Creative Commons license. You can feel free to look at it, adapt it as it might be useful for your organization, and if you share it, put it under Creative Commons also.
Awesome. That's great.
Very, very awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you for putting that forward.
Still here.
With that, as we're about ready to kind of wrap up and know that we got a bit busy there at the end of this, is there anything else that anybody wants to share kind of as we're in person and together thinking about this at the end of this year? Any reflections from last year of things that were really important to them, or looking forward of anything that sticks out that want to make sure that everybody is aware of? No pressure. Perfect. With that, I think that we need to go ahead and wrap on up and make sure everyone can get back to their busy day. To start with, I definitely want to thank Daniel for doing an amazing job of really leading this and taking it on and working extra hard on making sure that I'm coming on board in a nice, smooth way and that there'll be a smooth transition between the two of us. So thank you, Daniel, for sure for all that. And also want to give a great big shout out to ICRW. Thank you for hosting this and letting us use your wonderful conference space and all the technology and letting us really be here. And particularly to our panelists and to Maria and everybody for helping and bringing so much to light. Thank you for attending. Joy, there's still some stuff on that. We look forward to being in touch. Thank you.